Hello, I'm Lesley Atherton, and this story is called My Uncle's a Psycho. Even when I delve right back into my earliest memories, I knew that he was screwed up. That was why I needed no clues from the police when they arrived on my doorstep. No sooner had they introduced themselves than I said the words that had been darting around in my head for the last 20 years. I know why you're here. It's Colin. He's a serial killer, isn't he? I'd invited the officers into the living room and sat them down. I guess they were far more accustomed to denial, to shrieks of, "Oh my God," and determined statements of, "No, that's definitely not true. He's a lovely guy, keeps himself to himself, never been in any trouble." So when they asked me, "Why didn't you report him to us?" I told them the truth. I knew he was a psycho and a serial killer in the making. I knew what he was capable of, but what I didn't know was when he'd strike. And as I told the police, you can't arrest someone for their thoughts and for being an arse. My earliest memories were vibrant, hence unforgettable. We hung out a lot. We were kids together. One time, my Uncle Colin, who was only 6 years my senior, pinned me to the floor and used my chest as a trampoline. One time he listened in on a phone call and told my friend that she was a slapper because she had been sexually attacked at a party. Another time he ran onto the street grasping a yard brush, yelling and shrieking at the kids hanging out. She's a bad person, he shouted. "She always steals my friends." And how could anyone forget the time when he'd thrown the dog downstairs in the laundry basket, asking if I'd pay £1 million for him not to do it? I was an 8-year-old child. I didn't have more than 50 pence to my name. So my uncle threw the dog downstairs with a sneer and the accusation, "You did that, it's your fault," he's crying. I'm writing this because I know the story needs to be told. The world needs to know who and what my Uncle Colin is. And in answering those questions, I'll also answer another question. The answer to life, universe, and everything. Not in general, not for everyone, just for him. I was going to begin at the beginning, as that's where most stories start. Then I wondered if I should begin when Colin's crimes began in a formal way, at the point when the bell-ringing police arrived at my door. But the police have had little to do with solving my uncle's crimes or in apprehending him, so I decided to begin where my mind took me. I won't bore you with police procedure, as that's got absolutely nothing to do with the story I'm about to tell. It is my story and Colin's. It isn't a tale of police or trial. I started this writing to assist the police and as a convoluted statement, but it's grown and grown, as it seems that once I start writing, I can't stop. It's not pretty. Being 6 years older than me and part of a geographically close and emotionally close family, my Uncle Colin has always enjoyed a kind of power. When I was a toddler, he'd offer to change my pull-up nappy when I was potty training. I don't remember much of this, but I do remember Mum telling me years later that he had put all sorts into my nappy and had also opened the nappy up to look at the contents, then closed it again without removing a single piece of excrement. He seemed to enjoy getting people on their own and vulnerable, preferably partly dressed too. We went to a party when I had just started in high school. I guess that meant that he was in college. It was one of those family parties when you're visiting your auntie, not the sister of Colin, but simply your mum's good friend. Auntie Hannah had just one child who was a little older than me, but not as old as Colin. She was called Selina and we got on well. Colin, my big and already brutal uncle, called round. He'd watched us from his usual position on his front wall, and as soon as he arrived, he took Selina into the garden and climbed into the fish pond. He removed all the fish and threw them onto the lawn. Selina and I rushed around in a panic, attempting to pick them up and put them back, all the while screaming for our mothers. But when my mum and Auntie Hannah came out, Colin told them that he was putting the fish back and that it had been us who tried to kill them. Amazingly, our mums believed the older boy. Colin walked away with a smirk, while Selina and I got in big trouble. From that point on, I noticed that Colin was always believed. He just had that charisma that only truly psychopathic people have. Like you get sucked into it despite yourself, like you believe all the terrible things they tell you, and you decide that, yes, it must have been you who was at fault all along. He was a monster back then. So many fish died, and cats, birds from the garden too, and I hate to remember how many frogs he destroyed, and all the frog spawn he watched hatch, only to later fry the tadpoles in a pan over a camping stove. And it wasn't only animals that he hurt. I had a rubber plant on my window ledge, and I liked it. It was bold and beautiful, and I thought it was indestructible. It wasn't. Neither were my mum's red-hot pokers or Dad's roses. Not even Grandad's hydrangeas escaped his control. Insects, cars, desks, exercise books, even our parents. One time, Colin's dad made a tip trip. He was doing the best and most beautiful thing he could have done for his family. By removing some of the house's excess junk, he was helping them to lead a better life. The things he removed were mainly the boxes that items arrive in, and old unusable stuff, like school pants made for someone 10 years younger, and instruction manuals for now broken electrical items. But on his dad's return, what did Colin say? He said that he needed those things and that his dad had to get them back. Colin was furious when his dad refused his demand. Colin had a lot of flip-outs as a kid. I'm sure I had my share, but he had far more. Even when we were grown up, and even at family gatherings like my mum's epic Boxing Day party, he was awful to be with. We'd all be assigned chores, and he often swapped with the other teenagers so that he could take the drying shift to my washing up. I was immediately carried back to that time. God, I hated washing up next to him. Profound, he'd said, and it was immediately apparent that both syllables were stated with reluctance and disdain. Don't you approve, Colin? I don't, but then you know I wouldn't. Did I? Oh, I'm so sorry, Colin. I used his name, as I knew he hated it. What part was profound, Colin? My uncle looked away and appeared to be staring at the family group photo. Dull brown frame for a dull brown photo. Colin turned quickly and glared in my direction. Why do you never smile in photos? I had shrugged and continued drying the dishes. There was no way I was ever going to answer that question, and even less chance that I would ever be pleasant to him, even when forced to wash up alongside him. Demonic he was, evil, patronising and disgusting. How I had hated him, how I still did. But, unfortunately, our families were close. They had a fortnightly routine which continued for decades, with breaks only for holidays or sickness. Twice a month, every month, I'd arrive at the house of our parents, surrounded by family, and Colin and I would sit at opposite sides of the living room, while my mum and dad fussed and hovered. I'm still not sure how much his mum and dad understood about their errant son back then, how much they accepted, how much they suspected or sensed. I loved Colin's parents, but never accepted being his niece. Still, I had to dry up next to him. There was none of the silly foam-flicking washing up that may occur between family members who get on well, but neither was there explicit violence. It was more that we had an uneasy, temporary truce. I won't force myself to smile if I don't feel like it, I said, and you may have noticed that I don't smile much, even when I'm not in photos. Colin sponged an eye far too enthusiastically. Something to do with childhood issues, I suppose, I continued. I settled my gaze on a tea towel and my hands on a bohemian crystal brandy glass. I told myself not to grip it too hard, as it was one of my parents' wedding presents. I placed it on the counter in front of me and breathed deeply. I could hear Mum and Dad chatting in the living room, so I left Colin and went to join them. I'll finish washing up later, I said. Sit down and watch Inspector Morse with us, my mum suggested. Of course I did. They're still in my life, and I love them dearly. Sadly, Colin's parents aren't around anymore. Their car skidded on black ice when they were on their way home after a family event. Apparently, Colin had been following behind in his own car and had witnessed everything. He'd inherited their house. His siblings should have inherited many of their artworks, their car, their small boat and a lot of jewellery, but Colin kept hold of them all, and even a court order demanding that he release the items didn't change that. Anyway, as his sister Shona explained, without her mum and dad, the possessions were cold, they had lost their sparkle. She let him keep them, without fuss. Investigations indicated that there had indeed been a patch of black ice on the country lane, but I knew Colin was to blame. Just as I knew he'd been to blame years ago when a young woman was found concussed and raped and stuffed into the lining of an armchair tipped at the entrance to a local beauty spot. Though her attacker had worn an Iron Man mask and bulky clothing, I knew it was Colin from the words he said to her. "You're stupid. Don't you understand what I'm trying to do here? Why don't you smile?" When the holiday home for dogs was ransacked and about 20 poor animals had been butchered on the premises, local news showed a CCTV image of the perpetrator. I knew it was Colin, despite the Wolfman mask. It was the same when I arrived home after a night out and noticed a blood-stained dagger on my doorstep, the very same step that police arrived at just 3 years later. Back then, my boyfriend Chris wrote the blade off as a joke, but never had it been written off by me. I knew it was a warning, as it couldn't have been anything else. Later on the same night, the dagger reappeared on my doorstep. Chris and I were preparing for bed. We'd had a couple of drinks, so we were jolly and giggly, but nothing more. Chris went out to give Oscar the dog his final walk of the day. Neither of my 2 best boys returned. Chris was never found, but Oscar's collar had been carefully placed on the banks of Barkle Reservoir. I will never forget that night. How could I? How could anyone? So when people ask how I know that my Uncle Colin's a serial killer, I am prepared. I carry these sheets of paper in my bag at all times. It only takes one person on one occasion to listen, finally. My remaining wish is that the one person gets to me before Colin does.